What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Troponin episodes. We are on episode 17. Friendly reminder, if you're enjoying these episodes, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, check out teamtroponin.com, share on social media, and what's the thing I always forget?
Notifications.
Notification. It's one of these days I'll remember.
The last time it was comments, and you remember that one this time. I was drawing a blank.
We actually have a big content dump on Team Troponin the past week, so there's a lot of new stuff on there.
And a reminder for you guys too, anything that we get into on here in these episodes, all three of us have the opportunity to do kind of like a deep dive that we post on Team Troponin. So if there's anything you do have questions on that we talk about and you're like, hey, can you get into that? Leave us a comment below, because chances are we would love to do so. We just like to know what is interesting to y'all. So I'm going to kick off the conversation tonight talking about the sphenoid bone. Now, just kind of kidding, but kind of not. We want to talk a little bit about nasal breathing. I forget how we got on this topic.
Probably listening to me breathe.
Well, Justin and I are both heavy breathers, especially myself. But I think we were just talking about how, at some point, how it affected lifting, and maybe even I thought it might even affect your perception of effort, because one type of breathing is going to make you feel a little bit more panicky and exhausted, etc., versus another. But
yeah, nasal breathing increases, because you can actually have too much. You need the right amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen mixed, and nasal breathing gives you that. Nasal breathing, as I can't breathe through my nose, and I really saw this firsthand, because in 12-year-old All-Stars Little League, I was playing third base, and we were about to do a pickoff move, and Jeremy Vaness, who threw like 80 miles an hour as a 12-year-old, was pitching, and we were going to do the pickoff move, and I kind of shook my head like, no, we're not going to get him. And I looked back at the runner, and I looked back like this, and bam, baseball right to the nose, and like shattered my nose. So I couldn't breathe out of the left side of my nose from 12 until 4 or 5 years ago, when I finally had nasal surgery.
Wow.
And and I ended up having multiple broken noses. I had broken noses. When I was a freshman in college, I was snowboarding with some buddies who were very good snowboarders. I couldn't do much, so I was kind of like leaning on the hill, leaning up, watching them do jumps and tricks. And this guy's just streaming down the hill. Some other guy who didn't know how to snowboard or ski, I think he was on a snowboard. And right as I turned...
My PT brain is literally having a heyday thinking about you right now. Just having seen you lift, having seen how you move, all these things. Because if you can't inhale through your nose, you're not going to get the same respiratory diaphragm function. When respiratory diaphragm can't function the way it needs to, pelvic diaphragm can't function. And hate to say it, but pelvic floor mobility is just as important for dudes as it is for females, especially with leg development. And like overall lower body function.
Yeah, and that's why my legs suck.
100%.
But anyways, I took it right in the forehead, and it knocked him out. And then he got taken to the hospital. Somehow it didn't knock me out. I used to have a big bump, like a double nose kind of. I hate it, like a big hook nose, and that actually flattened it out.
Oh God.
And after that, it was kind of like flat. And then I broke it. My junior year in college of football, the air bladder broke in my helmet, but I loved the way the helmet fit without the air bladder, so I never reported it or anything. And so every game, the bridge of my helmet would come on, like slam down on my nose, so I broke that.
Okay, so now the PT in me that's all about like concussions is super.
Oh yeah. There was no concussion. There was no concussion. There was one game I know I had a concussion because I couldn't even. I was throwing up. I was concussed for sure. But I got put in as fullback, and anytime because I played defensive end, if I got put in fullback, it was either the lead block or I was pretty fast for my size, so it would be like a direct snap handoff to me on the goal line, and I just kind of close my eyes and run. Well, they devised this play a pass route for me, and they implemented it on the game when I had concussion, and I had no balance. I tripped and fell running a pass route. It was, but anyways, they went when I had surgery. They went in. And she found several breaks, and then a weird thing, because I always call it my stroke eye. My left eye, when I get lean, looks like I have a stroke, or used to. It doesn't really anymore because she fixed it. It turns out that there was fat. My orbital bone was broken at some point, and there was fat that got smashed into the bone when it was broken, and then healed around it, and it was still pulling on that fat, which was pulling my eye down like a stroke. And so she cauterized that. And cleared it out, and I still can't breathe as good through my left nose, but I can breathe now, and it completely changed. I mean, like I watched some of there's a shoulder training video I did, and like the first table talks I did with Dave Tate, where I sound like because I couldn't breathe on my nose at all.
Mm-hmm.
But and so really, it's much better. My wife specializes in sleep dentistry. She's a dentist, sleep dentistry, and she does a lot of nasal stuff. And so I know a little bit from hearing her. But yeah, you get the right amount of carbon dioxide, and there's actually you get more nitric oxide production when you breathe through your nose, and you don't get that when you breathe through your mouth. But it's even more important for humans now because our whole mouth and jaw and nasal cavity structure has changed largely because of the foods we eat. Because we eat soft foods.
Yep.
Traditionally, we didn't cook food, so if we ate any vegetable, it would be hard. If we ate any, so like everyone kind of jokes, like we got to do all this stuff for our teeth, and our teeth rot out. But if like, what did ancient humans do? Well, they didn't have to because it was a totally different like diet, and so and wisdom teeth. People you would say, I've heard people say like, the reason we have wisdom teeth is because people always lost their teeth before, and so there would be room for your wisdom teeth. That's not the case at all. We didn't lose our teeth, and there was room for our wisdom teeth because our jaw and facial structure was so much different and wider. And it was largely because we never ate cooked food. So everything we ate was really difficult. We had to chew really hard and really hard foods. And that would change our jaw structure. We'd have room for all our teeth. We wouldn't need braces. And then the way that would structure would pull our jaw forward and wider and create a more opening for our nasal cavity also.
So you're basically saying the way that our teeth grow in is a product of an evolving jaw structure that we don't really have anymore, but we still have those like now kind of maladapted teeth.
Yeah, and we could still have that jaw structure if we ate raw foods our whole life and if we had to chew really hard for all of our food. And so my wife could really talk about it in much more detail, but she gets if she sees me working out and breathing, because it can feel stressful, especially like for me, I could never breathe through my nose. So if I was breathing through my nose, that meant I was like suffocating for most of my life. And so I still have like a little mini panic when I get out of breath, like in the gym, my first thought is to breathe through my mouth. And if I force myself to breathe through my nose, I get a panic because I remember, like the Karate Kid, in the nose, out the mouth. And I was like, that's ridiculous. Your nose is tiny. My mouth is huge. I can suck way more air in this way.
So many jokes I'm not going to say.
Yeah, please don't. But I don't know where to go after that. But it's hard because like my first thought is to panic. I'm not getting enough air in, but you really do. Your blood vessels dilate. Your mixture of oxygen to CO2 is more optimal. Like that's like, like when you if you're hyperventilating, they have you breathe through your mouth in a bag or whatever.
There is such a thing as like there are people who are too focused on the nasal breathing, and so I think it's really important. You're hitting on a couple things. You're hitting on the physiologic process of the carbon dioxide and oxygen balance. It's going to change our blood pH. It's going to give us a signal to the nervous system to cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation, which is basically going to shuttle blood where we need it, right? Like that's basically what that does. But there's also a huge mechanical purpose, and if you think about it, we think about breathing as a respiratory process, and it is, but we use skeletal muscles. And those skeletal muscles, how well we use them, how efficiently we use them, change how our bones, I don't want to say like how they sit, but how we use our posture, for lack of a better word. So like someone who can't nasal breathe, you look at them and they're going to have like really, really like hypertonic delts, pecs, necks. Their thoracic spine is probably going to be really, really flat. The rib cage probably isn't going to move very much. And every time they breathe, they're going to be here. And if you think about small scale, 24 hours a day, if someone is breathing that way, that will change our development. I think the other really, really like kind of crazy thing about this too is how much, just from the sympathetic and parasympathetic side of things, we access via our respiration, which really targets, again, skeletal muscles, but also influences vagal tone. When we're lifting, Dave, you brought up a good point that some people are going to feel like it's going to be higher effort on certain things. Justin, do you have like an optimal level of like hype up or like optimal level of arousal that you train at?
No, happy. I don't do anything. I don't understand. Very rarely will I get myself worked up, but if I do, it's got to be like even a 1 rep something, and it's got to be something where I'm not thinking about form. I don't know if I'm missing out on something by not hyping up, but my brain always feels like it's just wasting energy. So I just.
Okay.
Yeah, I just go into, I just start my set.
If you've ever watched people who usually have like an optimal level of like hype up or not, and you watch their breathing patterns, like you're gonna see there's a little bit of a correlation. And those people who, if they have, let's say, on the pendulum or on a scale of 0 to 10, they like to be in like a certain range, maybe like a 3 to 5. If you see them get into that 7 or 8 range, you're gonna see an entire shift in their body posturing before they even touch the bar, or before they pick up the dumbbells, or before they get to the machine or anything. Like if you watch Dave, he's a really calm lifter. If he amps up too much before a set, the like tone levels, and what I mean by tone levels is if you think about like all the muscles in your body having a volume switch, or a dial rather, the dial for so many muscles gets turned up so far that he's all of a sudden lifting in like a different neurological state.
It screws everything up.
I think I feel like I'm the same way. That's interesting.
You always used to tell me, like when you were spotting me on something more technically demanding, like a dumbbell press, you'd remind me not to get too hyped up. Mm-hmm. And I don't usually get hyped up, but I would for a movement like that because it was particularly hard for me, and pressing has always been a weakness. So I'm like, all right, here's where I gotta hype up. But that would screw the setup because, like with a dumbbell press, just to get in a good position is tough. You have to kick them up just right and like catch them in the right position and use, kick up forcefully enough, but not so forcefully that it ends up like behind your head, and then you have to correct for that. And it always goes better when I'm just kind of at my own optimal level of arousal.
And it's interesting because your last rep, every time I think you have 2 or 3 in the tank, you end up getting 1 more because you amp up for that last rep, and your technique completely changes. It's just really interesting.
To go back to the muscle structure, our facial structures will change between being a mouth breather and a nasal breather also.
Yes.
I don't know all of it, but I know it's actually like counter to what you think. Like you hear like a mouth breather. You think like a knuckle dragging mouth breather. Mouth breathers actually tend to have really weak jaw lines, like softer, rounder jaws. I don't remember all of it. Again, this is just from hearing my wife talk, but that's your whole facial structure will change just from how you normally breathe. And another interesting thing, this is a sidetrack, but like most bodybuilders, especially the most male bodybuilders, and a lot of people in general, because of the way our facial structures have changed over time, need a CPAP. And and I always had sleep apnea, need a CPAP, but most people take them off all the time. There's newer devices, and one of the things my wife does with her sleep dentistry is there's like a dual mouthpiece device, and I sleep with it every night. And it's like a top and bottom mouthpiece, really precisely formed. They do a mold of your mouth with these thick bands. And I say bands, they're not bands. They don't stretch. They technically could. They might stretch a millimeter or 2, but they're very, very heavy and thick. And it pulls your lower jaw forward, almost like an underbite. And
this is so fascinating to me right now. My brain, because this is so in line with like what I do when I look at with respiration patterns.
Oh, cool. You would love to talk to my wife then. But it's been a life changer for me, between being able to breathe out of my nose and this, because when I first got it, it was shortly after the nose surgery. And so when I put it in my mouth, I'd really struggle with panicking that I wasn't going to be able to breathe because I had to breathe out of my nose. I sleep 5-6 hours a night, and I'm more rested than I used to with like 8-9 hours of sleep. I don't sleep past 6 hours. I just pop out of bed. And I with my CPAP, I dreaded putting it on. I take it off in the middle of the night without knowing it. If we went on vacation, I'd be like, I'm not taking it. I hate that thing. This thing, if I'm like exhausted on the couch, like when you don't want to go to bed, it's like, I will get up and get that thing and go back to the couch even. I will not go to sleep without it because it's been an absolute life changer. I wish more people knew about it because most people just go, the CPAP, and it works, but the CPAP's like it's keeping your airway open by forcing air in there, basically. This is keeping your airway open by forcing your jaw into the proper alignment. And
it's a pressure management system more than anything. And I think people kind of forget that ultimately, whether we're lifting or doing anything else, so much of what we're doing is managing pressure between different paths, right? So like we have our esophagus and we have our trachea, and our ability to manage pressure through our jaw, through our neck, through our abdomen, it's all, actually, one of the things that I see in lifters a lot is they cannot inhale through their nose quietly. And so I'm going to back up and get real nerdy for a sec. There's a school of thought called PRI, or Posture Restoration Institute. They look a lot at the role of the diaphragm and how our respiration patterns play into these musculoskeletal like asymmetries or patterns that we get into. And one of the things that I've noticed in working with lifters who are different from like the normal people, I don't know why I air quoted that,
There's a guy. This is a quick side joke. There's a guy on Facebook who that I don't know how I'm friends with him, but he doesn't know how to use quotes or parentheses, but he tries to.
Oh, cute.
So he spells everything correctly. It's really odd, but he'll just randomly, like, just randomly he'll have, and then bracket, and then sometimes he'll do like a space between the bracket and the word, and then the word and the space in the bracket. Just and it cracks me up because I know he must read things and see these in there and like, oh, people who know how to write use these things. I need to implement this. Sorry, it
You
just
come
cracks me.
across as very offensive if you put quotes in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that he's done that. That's what's funny is because you see why they are where they're supposed to be, and because he's done stuff all the time, like because he's got like little daughters and a wife, and some of the times when he'll put it in there, it's like that's not saying what you think you want it to say. But sorry.
Yeah.
Where are we going?
Lifters,
Lifters and respiration.
respiration. This is what I do every day. Mouth breathing, nasal breathing. Okay, so like one of the things I look at a lot is the ability to control the core, right? And so everyone wants to talk about rib cage position, and I'm actually going to talk a little bit about this at Swiss. How when we exhale, our ribs should move down, and oftentimes, if you think about the length-tension relationship in a muscle, we think about that all the time in the perspective of lifting, meaning you want to purposely create an advantage or disadvantage depending on your goal and depending on the movement. But low key, again, on the volume switch day to day, muscles like our internal obliques actually should have a little bit of overlap with our diaphragm on opposite sides of the rib cage. And when our ribs get flared out, our obliques actually lose their mechanical advantage to help us stabilize. So if you see people with those like really, really forward rib cages, they can't brace and they overuse their six pack. And they're like, well, I think I'm bracing, but I always have this back pump. And I'm like, yeah, you think? Because you're not actually bracing. But one of the things that I've noticed is that if you get an exhale and the ribs move down, keeping the obliques in a better position because they're less lengthened. The second most people go to inhale, instead of being able to like quietly inhale and have some eccentric abdominal control, and a quiet inhalation is going to come from nasal breath. It's all neck, it's all low back, and they end up using their low back to inhale to try to elevate their chest. And it's just such an interesting strategy, and it's one of those things that if you can't nasal breathe and you don't have eccentric abdominal control on like a low key, you're probably not going to be able to access it when you need it, either under bar or under heavy weights or posing. That's another one I see all the time. So and again, it all comes down to nasal breathing. It's one of those really nerdy things that I'm like, I actually asked someone this week, I was like, can you take a video of you breathing? Because I need to hear your respiration quality. And they went with it, thank God, because I have their trust. But like, it's just fascinating to me. And it's one of the things that I didn't really fully appreciate until I was like, wow, I cannot inhale. And it's different for me if I lie on my left and right sides, because I have that right pelvis injury from the adductor tear. So if I lie on my right side and I try to nasal breathe, no bueno. My left side, good to go. It's really fascinating because that's going to shift where our center of mass sits and our organs sit. So if you lay on your left side, things are kind of shifted left. Anyway, that's a whole different.
Yeah, I had to eat crow on the whole nasal thing because I really like I'm not coachable, not in a bad way, but just if it doesn't make sense to me, I won't do it. I have to, so I'll reason through everything, and I struggle like the nasal breathing, like when coaches would talk about that, or make you breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth, and I would always be like, bullshit, I can suck way more air through my, and then now like learning all this stuff.
I'm only using a third of my lungs, but other than that.
Yeah, well now going back, I'm like, man, what an idiot. Well, like sometimes I should probably just trusted people, but I'm not a very trusting person.
It's been interesting looking at like how many people are using the nasal breathing strips now too, because if you think about the gapping that it creates, right? Because that's basically what it does. Is if someone can't nasal breathe, it's not always because of one reason, and I think it's kind of like back pain, right? Where like there's not always just one cause for back pain. If you're having a hard time actually nasal breathing, we were talking before this podcast about how beautifully complex orofacial musculature and orofacial bone structure is. Like there are so many bones that make up the sinuses that we breathe through. There's like 5 different bones and they're all like butterfly shaped and like weird. And so just because like you put a nose strip on doesn't necessarily mean you're getting good inhalation. If you're not getting good inhalation, you're probably going to have, quite frankly, shitty exhalation too. And again, exhalation is where you're going to be able to get diaphragm and abs in a position and make your training better, which is what we all care about.
That was so hard for me when you first were like trying to get me to nasal breathe more. We'd go to Iron Warrior in Denver before I'd squat, and I'd get on the ground to do a 90-90, and like I couldn't nasal breathe in without like panicking.
We'll even take it more recent, take it to Tampa, when I had you go to that supported wall reach. And I was like, can you just stop for a second? Don't worry about what you're feeling. Just listen to yourself. And you can hear versus very different. And you're going to get different muscular control with it. Again, like the interplay between our muscular system and our respiratory system, like we just keep them so boxed as separate in Western medicine, but they're functioning for one body, one unit, and I think it needs to be treated appropriately. All right, talking all things delts. Delts are one of those muscles that when you have healthy shoulders, they look really, really nice and round, and when you're dealing with an injury, it can be really hard to develop things. So Dave and I have a mutual client where he does the actual coaching programming, and then I take over a lot of the PT and give a lot of cues for regular training. Do you want to talk a little bit about the particular client and kind of what you've done and worked on, and then I'll give my 2 cents in terms of problem solving?
Yeah. As far as the training concerned, it's fairly simple to talk about. I mean, this guy has basically some shoulder issues, and Danny could talk a lot more intelligibly about what those issues really are. But basically, we've had to work around the shoulder issue when it comes to shoulder training. And actually, I think usually you think shoulder issues and you assume someone's going to have trouble pressing. And he's had a little bit of that, but his pressing has actually been progressing mostly very well for a long time. And a lot of the issues he has are actually with lateral raise movements, which, as any bodybuilder knows, are really essential to getting that big cap side delt. It was actually the point where now that things are a lot better, you can look back to like his first prep and his first showing compared to the next one. And obviously there's a big increase in size, so his delts are going to look better from that. But from having improved orthopedically, his delts are looking much rounder. And I think you'll find that with a lot of muscle groups where if someone has some injury that's really preventing good output from a muscle, they're not necessarily going to lose a lot of like size in terms of actual muscle tissue, maybe not actual contractile tissue, but they'll lose a ton of fullness. And so we saw his delts kind of came back to life over the last year, thanks really to a lot of the stuff that Danny had been doing for rehab and prehab. But it is still a bit of a persistent issue that we always have to be careful about. And so one of the things that I think delts respond particularly well to is metabolic work. And depending on who you talk to these days, they'll say that metabolic work or like high rep pumpy work isn't all that useful for actually building any tissue size. And I kind of halfway agree with that. It depends on the muscle, depends on the movement. But with delts, it really seems like they respond very well to a lot of higher volume, or in particular high density training. Basically, what can you do to get not just a lot of blood in the muscle, but a lot of like decent tension work in a short amount of time. So just for example, recently, his raises were going okay, but whereas I might normally want to give someone something like a rest pause or a bunch of clusters with a full range raise, I was afraid that under fatigue, his shoulder issues were going to kind of flare up because, technique tends to degrade at least a little bit when you're in those high fatiguing kinds of sets, like a cluster set. And so I suggested, well, why don't we do some more metabolic work, such as, just for example, the old like Meadows style weird side delt swings, which if you've never seen that, it's basically just bottom third or so of the range of motion done for super high reps. It looks a little bit silly, almost like you're just doing a really cheaty raise, but it tends to work really well, especially when you say superset it with something like start with full range raise, fatigue yourself, and then finish off with the partials. Just for one example, but that's the kind of thing that I think can work really well for certain muscles that respond to it, and in cases where you can't do a lot of high fatigue work for an area that is susceptible to some kind of orthopedic flare-up.
Well, let's back up even more, because on his program that you have, we use TrueCoach to deliver training to clients, and on his program, he was doing a cable lateral raise, and you were kind of like, we need to figure out a way to progress this. And I don't know that you'd really thought much about the metabolic work or where you were going to take things, but my answer to that was by manipulating the profile of the exercise so that you can hit delt in multiple ranges and multiple strength curves and multiple lengths in terms of overload. So, I didn't realize that you were even thinking metabolic work.
Oh, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Okay, well, then we can disregard the conversation. Because it sounds like, just from my standpoint, you want to maximize being opportunistic, right, is really what it comes down to. And I think a lot of letting training be the rehab just comes down to being opportunistic in terms of where you're loading the muscle and at what level of fatigue. So obviously the things that are more challenging to load, you want to load first, which is often going to be one extreme, either the shorten or the lengthen position, depending on the muscle. And making sure that you're choosing an exercise that allows you to manipulate trunk angle and torso position, especially for delts, side delts in particular, that allows you to actually hit side delt. And what a lot of people end up doing is they end up leaning back on a lot of their side delt movements and hitting a lot of upper trap work. And if you're someone who already has some sort of shoulder issues, there's a lot of neurogenic posturing that goes on. Like Justin too, anytime you grab a dumbbell, the first thing that happens is your shoulders like to roll forward. That's kind of your neurogenic posture. And I think that for a lot of people, as soon as you put weights in their hand, whether they like to internally rotate at the shoulder or at the elbow, or pronate rather, or they like to end up kind of shrugging through their movements, making sure that you're matching the exercise itself to the level of acute fatigue accrual in that moment. I think there are a lot of ways that people could argue are right or wrong based on, well, evidence says this, that, or the other. But I think at the end of the day, anytime you're coaching, you have to look at, evidence might say one thing, but if you look at someone's movement pattern and it looks like they're fatiguing more, where they should be able to put that later in the like giant set or in the metabolic work, you have to be able to rearrange and dissociate from what the textbook might say should happen, just based on leverages, fatigue factors, things like that. Bracing is another one that we really looked at with him, even during delt movements, like laterals. But yeah, I think for people who have that kind of injury, I'm a huge fan of metabolic work and just making sure that you're matching opportunism with their current level of ability.
For more content like this, visit www.teamtroponin.com.
This video is brought to you by First Attachment Nutrition, battle-tested nutrition, expert formulated supplements. Join the First Attachment revolution.